I'm taking another moment to scan through to see your faces. What a great bracha to see so many members of our Bait family and community, teachers, mentors, friends, family, fellow travelers, which feels like the right description for the words I want to share this Shabbat HaGadol. So thank you to each and every one of you for carving out the time to be with me, to be with each other. I hope and pray that this coming Shabbat Shuvah, next Shabbat HaGadol, will be words shared in person in the warmth, the embrace, and the spiritual uplift of our main sanctuary together. But I'm grateful for the blessing of seeing each and every one of you here. Koos Yeshua Tehesa O Beshem Adonai Echad Koos Let us lift up a cup of salvation and call out to God. Let us lift up 4 cups of salvation and call out to God. More than anything else, our companion for the Seder night a week from now is the Arba Kosot, the 4 cups. I want to share tonight a journey about how the 4 cups are our companion on the journey of the Seder night. To argue that the Seder, more than anything else, is meant to be experienced as a journey, and that no symbol guides us through that journey, practically and symbolically, more than the Arba Kosot, the 4 cups. And to try to glean lessons from the symbolism, the meaning, the origins of those cups that can guide us this Seder night and every Seder night, especially this year. I want to begin by trying to strengthen this argument that the 4 cups, more than anything else, are the framework for our Seder and help us understand the Seder as a journey. Starting with source 1, the Gemara and Psachim, those who are Daf Yomi learners. We're grateful to the teachers and students of Daf Yomi in our Bait have been studying these pages in recent weeks. And the Gemara in the 10th parak of Tractate Psachim says, Tnu Rabbanan, Hakol chayavin ba'arba'a kosot halalu, echad anashim ve'echad nashim ve'echad tinokot. Everybody is obligated in these 4 cups, men, women, and children, tinokot, literally babies. Rabbi Yehuda asks the question, what benefit do children have from wine? Better give them something sweet, something fun, something that won't cause them to fall asleep so they'll be awake to engage and participate in the Seder night. It's rare to see a mitzvah described as one that obligates children. And in fact, the medieval commentaries, some try to fit this in the normative framework. Of course, it's only children who have reached the age of education. And others say no. The opinion cited here at the beginning suggests that every child, no matter their age, is required, invited to participate in some way, shape, or form in the mitzvah of the Arba Kosot. In its expansiveness, its inclusivity, the way it involves everyone, it's so symbolic of the vision of the Seder. And on to the second source, Tzarich lishtot arba kosot al haseder. Here I take it almost as a play on words. These 4 cups are upon the Seder. They mark the order. There's no Seder, no order, and no Seder night without these 4 cups. And in fact, if you drank them one after another, and we'll come to this point a little bit later, not following the mile markers, as I like to call them, of the Seder night, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. Just to flesh this point out a drop more, we're going to take a moment's survey through the 10th chapter of Tractate Psachim in the Mishnayot to allow us to appreciate, and the bolded sections here are the places where the four cups are mentioned. The very first Mishnah starts to talk about being prepared to eat matzah with an appetite on Pesach night and says, Lo yifchetulo me'arba kosot shel yain. The first thing we have to make sure is that every member of the community, including the needy among us, have, most of all, their 4 cups of wine. It's not a Seder without the 4 cups of wine. And then the second Mishnah begins envisioning the Seder night, as the translation here introduces. The Tana describes the beginning of the Passover Seder. Mazgulo kos rishon. They pour the first cup. And so the Seder journey begins with Kadesh, the first cup. The Mishnah goes on to describe a debate about the language of Kadesh, and then goes on, Mazgulo kos sheni. They pour the second cup, and now the child asks the parent, and we begin with the Manish Shana and the entire journey of the Magid, which occupies the next few Mishnayot, coming to the conclusion, the Chotem B'Geula. We conclude the Magid section with our blessing of redemption, and that blessing, Baruch Atah Hashem Ga'al Yisrael, blessed are you, Lord, who redeemed Israel, is followed, of course, with the next blessing, the second cup of wine. The Seder continues through its next units, and as we come to the very end of the 10th chapter of Psachim, we're told, Mazgulo kos shlishi mevarech al mezono. We pour the third cup of wine. We say Birkat Hamazon. Revi'i gomer alav et hahalel. The fourth cup, we complete the Hallel. Hopefully we see from here clearly that more than perhaps any other symbol, any other aspect of the Passover night, more than the matzahs, more than the maror, the karpas, the charoset, even the Seder plate, the Arba Kosot are the framework. They're the mile markers for our Seder night. They're the thing that help us realize that we're on a journey. A light analogy in my mind is to in-flight drink service. It's like you know you're on a journey because someone keeps stopping by to offer to refill your cup, to make sure you're nourished and taken care of all the way through from the beginning to the end. It's those cups of wine that help us remember we're starting somewhere, we want to end somewhere different. We're on a journey with others, and there are messages and lessons to take away from this journey. I think the Arba Kosot are too often in the background. We don't think about their centrality and their importance. Maybe it's because we drink cups of wine at all kinds of other occasions. Maybe it's because they're not mentioned in the Torah, which talks about other symbols of the Pesach night, of the Seder. Tonight, I want to foreground them. While a full analysis of the Arba Kosot is beyond the scope of what we can do in the hour or so that we'll have together, I want to spotlight the Arba Kosot in 4 different ways. It's appropriate for this year because more than any other year I can remember, we've actually all been on a journey together. We journey individually, we journey in our household units, we journey with cohorts, communities, family. But was there ever a year in which it felt that truly collectively, as a Bayit community, as a world, we were on the same journey? We've been on a journey together this year, and the Seder is a microcosm of that journey. And so it feels like the most appropriate year to look at the symbols that guide us on that journey, the Arba Kosot. I remember very vividly sitting in front of this screen last Shabbat HaGadol. Perhaps you too remember those moments together, or certainly last Pesach. Our focus in the Shabbat HaGadol drasha was the Shoresh Shin Mem Resh. Shmirah, Leil Shimurim, a night of protection. Think back a year ago. We were terrified. There was so much unknown. The things we most basically needed and didn't know if we would have were protection and safety for ourselves and those around us. A sense of security when all that was familiar was pulled out from beneath us. We're in a different place now, even though the journey continues to be challenging. Even though there are those who were with us last Shabbat HaGadol who aren't with us now, and new ones who have joined us. It is a different place. It's a time to look back on the journey, even though the journey isn't finished. Try to extract some lessons from the road we have traveled together to the road we have yet to travel. So our tall order tonight, these 4 tall cups of wine, to understand the source of the 4 cups, what they tell us about redemption, and what the end of the journey should look like. To take a second look at the source of the four cups and ask the question, whom are we journeying with and to whom are we responsible on this journey? To engage in a debate about the purpose and function, different from the source, the purpose and function of the four cups, and what it tells us about redefining our relationship to Torah and mitzvot in this pandemic year. And finally, to come to the symbolism of the very kos, the cup itself, and what it tells us about what we can and cannot control on the journey of this pandemic, in life's journey. Let's make our way to the sources, the origins of the four cups of the Seder night. There are two key sources that share almost identically the vision of the source, the minayin, the from where do we derive the idea of the Arba Kosot. The first is a Talmud Yerushalmi, which is here in source 4, and the second is a passage in Breshit Rabbah, a midrash in Breshit. They're almost identical. So we'll focus our learning on the source in the Talmud Yerushalmi, and on a few occasions, I'll reference the parallel in Breshit Rabbah, which offers a counterpoint to a few of the points made here in the Yerushalmi. Minayin la'arba'a kosot. From where do we know the requirement to drink 4 cups? Think about it for a moment. Think about the sources for the Seder. Think about the story of the Passover night in Mitzrayim. Minayin, where do these 4 cups actually come from? I encourage you to start to percolate in your mind some of the possible answers you might have to this question. We'll see some of them as we go. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rav that Rabbi Benaiah said, Keneged arba gu'ulot, in reference to, related to, corresponding to, the 4 redemptions. What are the 4 redemptions? They seem to be 4 verbs of promise made in Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 to 7, as the Midrash continues, where the Torah says, therefore say unto the children of Israel, God says to Moshe, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out, etc. Take you to me for a people. And here, those 4 verbs mentioned in those psukim are listed in succession. Behotzeti, behitzalti, vega'alti, velakachti. I will bring you out, I will rescue you, I will save you, and I will take you. We'll look at them in context a little bit later. But let's suffice from here to say the story of foretelling, God's foretelling, promising to Moshe the redemption of the Jewish people from Egypt has 4 verbs that proceed in a journey. And from those 4 verbs of redemption, we derive the source that we should too have 4 markers along our journey from slavery to freedom, which at its most basic is what the journey of Pesach night is all about. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi Amar, Keneged arba'a kosot shel Paro, corresponding to the 4 wine cups of Paro. In Exodus chapter 40, we'll look there too in more depth in a few moments. But in the meantime, you'll recall that this is the butler's dream, which he relays to Yosef in prison. V'chos Paro biadi, the cup of Paro was in my hand. V'aschatotam el kos Paro, I took those grapes that I dreamed about in my dream, and I squeezed them into the cup of Paro, and I placed the cup on Paro's hand. And later on, when Yosef interprets the dream and says to the butler, you will indeed be restored, and you will, again, place the cup of Paro into his hand. 4 mentions of Paro's cup, says Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. These are the sources for the 4 cups at the Seder night. If you're like me, the direct application here is perhaps a little less clear, but we'll get there. Rabbi Levi adds the 4 kingdoms, those 4 nations that have oppressed or exiled the Jewish people over our history. And the last bit, 4 punishments and 4 redemptions, will come to as we make our way through. By the way, this list is not exhaustive. Rav Kasher, in his Haggadah Shlema and in his comments on Parashat Ve'era, counts about 15 4s that have been cited across Jewish tradition as sources for the 4 cups. Does one of these 2 first sources, because I'll argue a little bit later that these 2 are the most frequently used, do one of these 2 sources have primacy over the other? Is one seem like a more likely origin for the 4 cups? I think if you stopped someone on the street who knew something about the Seder and the history of Jewish textual tradition and asked them, where do we have an origin story for the 4 cups in the Torah? They would certainly suggest the first one. The 4 languages of Geula, That's where we know we need to have 4 mile markers on the journey to redemption on the Seder night. It certainly is the most familiar. And here in the Yerushalmi, it's listed first, which is perhaps striking because the story of the Kos Paro in the butler's dream appears first in the Torah. So clearly these sources are not listed in the order that they appear in the Torah. So perhaps the placement of the Shmot languages of redemption first suggests to us a certain primacy to it. This is the main one. And the story of the butler's dream comes second. But if we journey down to the source in Breshit Rabbah, the parallel, commenting on the butler's dream right there, reads as follows. B'chos paro biadi. Paro's cup was in my hand, and we have the 4 mentions. Says the Midrash, Mikan kav'u chachamim arba kosot shel leilei Pesach. It's from here, from this story in Breshit, that the sages established the 4 cups on Pesach night. Then Rav Huna, citing Rabbi Benaiah, says, no, it's keneged arba geulot shenemru b'Mitzrayim. It's those 4. And then we have yet another repetition of the butler's dream. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman says, it's keneged arba kosot, comes back to it and repeats it yet again. From Breshit Rabbah, it seems like this Genesis story is the Genesis story of the 4 cups from here. But of course, it's never quite so simple. Alternative versions of this midrash don't say mikan kavu, from here, from this Breshit story, they established it, and then go back and list a new list in which the Breshit example appears again. But they read this first line, not mikan, but me'echan. From where did the sages establish it? If that's the case, then this is not actually an assertion that the Breshit story is first. Because this story is one of the examples, the midrash cites it here. But it starts again with the Shmot example, and only then comes to the Breshit example. So as we reflect on these 2 and their centrality, it's hard to say whether one is perhaps more important than the other, but we can understand why the Shmot example, the 4 languages of redemption, have become more familiar to us. First, the link seems more natural and significant, and second, in the midrashim and sources where it's mentioned, it seems to take pride of place by being mentioned first. I hope tonight to extract as much meaning from that passage as I can, but also to really try to lift up the Breshit story. Because in fact, Rashi doesn't seem to be willing to take sides in the debate between which of these 2 sources is more important or more fundamental to the source and the idea of the 4 cups. Rashi, in 2 different places in the 10th chapter of Tractate Psachim, where the Seder night is described, on 2 different mentions of the 4 cups, offers 2 different sources. Here in Psachim 108, talking about women's obligation in the 4 cups, Rashi says, Arba'a kosot, shlosha keneged gimel kosot shene'emru bepasuk zeh v'chos paro bi'adi v'gomer, u'revi'i birkat hamazon. Rashi does something a little bit different. We don't have the opportunity to get into the expanse of 3 cups, 4 cups, or 5 cups, and how many languages are actually appear in the different locations, but I'm just flagging that there's much more to that story. But Rashi here, talking about women's obligation in the Arba Kosot, says, because the source of the Arba Kosot is the Kosot of Paro, the cups of wine mentioned in the butler's dream. Earlier on in Psachim 99b, on the very first Mishnah, Arba Kosot, Rashi mentions Keneged Arba'a Lashonei Geula, in parallel to the 4 languages of redemption, here in Parashat Va'era, the 2 key examples that we saw in the Midrash and in the Talmud Yerushalmi. I don't believe Rashi mentions any of the other ones. And so it seems that he carries equally the weight of these 2 possible ones, lifting them up from above the other sources to be our 2 most basic considerations for the origin story of the 4 cups on the Seder night. Of course, at this point, we can already understand that these 2 things don't seem like real sources, but more what we would call in yeshiva terminology, asmachtot. Already there was some idea that there should be 4 cups of wine, but the rabbis, having established or followed that tradition, asked, what can we glean from the Torah to help understand the deeper meaning of those 4 cups of wine? We will yet see a debate about why there should be 4 cups of wine, having nothing to do with the psukim in Breshit and in Shmot. But once that custom was established, the rabbis, as they always do, look to deepen an understanding of their meaning and their symbolism by grounding them in parts of the Torah. And they offer us these 2 key stories. In fact, perhaps even more important than why we have the four cups, for me, is what their origin story is and what we can learn from that origin story. So what can we learn from that origin story? We're ready for our first message, our first question, which requires us to take a drop of a closer look at the psukim, the sources that have been cited for these four cups, in order to understand what they might mean for us. And here I want to invite us to ask the first question of these, so to speak, four questions about the four cups. On a journey, which is ostensibly on Seder night, the journey from slavery to freedom, from oppression to redemption, what is the end point of the journey? How do we know we've arrived at something looking like the end? What will it look like when we get there? So let's begin with the story in Shemot. Moshe has arrived in Mitzrayim after some coaxing and has gone straight to Paro, showed him some signs and wonders, and asked him to make life better for the Jewish people, indeed to set them free. Paro says, "Who is this God after all that you're bringing to me?" And says, not only will I not let them go, but I'm going to make their life harder, not easier. And so these languages of Geulah don't just come at any particular time in the Jewish people sojourning and in servitude in Mitzrayim. They actually come at the darkest moment. Moshe has come out from Paro and been accosted by Jewish people saying, "You were supposed to make our lives better. You've made them worse. You were supposed to be our redeemer. You've caused us suffering." Moshe is despairing, and God comes to him in the darkest of moments and says, "You will see what I will do to Paro. I will send the Jewish people free." And God comes to Moshe and says, "Ani Hashem." And now listen, as God essentially grounds God's relationship to the Jewish people in promises and commitments of the past, and then establishes a vision for the future. And through that vision, shares the four languages of redemption, which come to be the source for our four cups. Ani Hashem, says God, I appeared to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov as Kel, Shakai, but I did not make my four-letter name, Yod He Vav He, known to them. And I established my covenant. God is ticking off for Moshe here, God's accomplishments, God's commitment to the Jewish people. And now I've heard the moaning of the Israelites. Va'ezkor et beriti, I remembered my covenant. So say to the Jewish people that I am the Lord, and I will take them out of the suffering of Egypt. I will save them from their servitude. I will redeem them, and I will take them to me as a nation. Now, the first thing, of course, to note is that the messages aren't over. They're still, I'm going to take them to the land. I'm going to give it to them. There are actually 7 languages of redemption in this passage. But somehow we are satisfied to stop at number 4. The first point I want to draw out of here is to understand that a vision of redemption doesn't mean that things are perfect. It doesn't mean we've gotten to the finish line, but it means we've freed ourselves from the most profound clutches of the thing which has made us its slave. It means we've been taken forth, we've been saved, and we've been redeemed, even if we haven't been brought and given the ultimate vision that we have. But fundamentally, the message of this source, in times of rock bottom, we can still dream of a better future. That future doesn't mean that we've gotten to a perfect end game, but it means that we have been released from some of the hardest sufferings. And it means that we look forward to a new future. It was radically new for the Jewish people. They had no idea what to expect. They had no relationship with the land of Canaan. They were going forth to a complete unknown, a new future. That, I think, is the most typical definition of redemption. We're going forth from a place of terrible suffering to a new future, something that is extraordinary that we can hardly even dream of. And as we go along the way, at each step, we feel closer and closer and a sense of redemption, even if we're not all the way at the finish line. But when we look at the story in Breshit, I think it sends us in a totally different direction. Remember what's happening here. It's another kind of rock bottom moment for the butler. He had been a good faith servant of Paro. All the Torah tells us is chatu. He and the baker had sinned. Paro got angry, and on the whim of an angry despot, threw the butler into jail, where he was for Yamim Rabim. He was there for many days. And then he had a frightening dream. Yosef saw him aggrieved, his face had fallen, and asked him, "Why are you so upset?" And he told him, "I had a dream and I don't even know how to interpret it." The butler in so many ways is like the Jewish people. He's been imprisoned, he's been enslaved. He can maybe barely remember his life as it once was. And he has this confusing dream. He asks Yosef for help. The dream was of 3 clusters of grapes that quickly ripened, and now we encounter the dream in the middle as he's telling it to Yosef. Paro's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes and pressed them into Paro's cup and placed the cup into Paro's hand. Yosef says to him, this is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Paro will pardon you and restore you to your post. You'll place Paro's cup in his hand, as was your custom formerly when you were his cupbearer. And Yosef goes on. But think of me when all is well with you again, and do me the kindness of mentioning me to Paro, so as to free me from this place. This source rocks our world. It invites us to see a vision of redemption as something radically different than the one which the Jewish people were seeking in the moments of Exodus chapter 6. It's not a journey from a past to a new future. It's not a vision of redemption, of revolution, but rather of restoration, of return. What is it that Yosef promises the butler will happen? V'hashivacha al kanecha. You're just going to go back to the way things used to be. You're again going to place kos paro biado. You're going to be the servant of Paro that you once were. Kamishpat harishon. Just like the way things used to be. Even for comparison's sake, look at how the 2 sources end with the language of giving, of nitina. For the Jewish people, it's natati ota lachem morasha ani Hashem. I'm going to give you a new land that you barely know existed. It's the land of your ancestors, but you don't know that land. I'm going to give you something radically new. And what is it that the butler is giving? The exact same thing he used to give before. The very same cup of paro. The message of this source for the 4 cups is that sometimes the goal of a journey, sometimes redemption, is about landing back exactly where we started. We were in a good place. We were diverted from our path, and we return. We are no doubt different people than we were before, but our liberation and freedom is about restoration, return. On the Seder night, both are true. No doubt our vision as a Jewish people, from slavery to freedom, and our journey as Jews is always about moving forward into a new future. It's always about growing and evolving and progressing. But our calendar is not linear. It's cyclical. It's that helix. It's about returning to the place we were too. 1 notch up, 5781, not 5780. But Pesach again, Rosh Hashanah again, Purim again. Coming back to the place where we were, but making it a new future. How true this is of this pandemic year. But here it's the opposite. Our first instinct is to define redemption as modeled after the Breshit story. It's to say all we want in this time is v'natata kos paro biado kamishpat harishon, to just be able to go back to the way things were. We were free to work and serve, eat and drink without worry. And then we were knocked off of our foundations and put in jail, in lockdown, some of us alone. We just dreamt of getting back to the way things were. And if we accept Rashi's contention that both of these stories are the source of the Arba Kosot, of our journey narrative, then the Shmot story tells us that the journey will have to bring us to someplace new. That on the other side, we will have to look at life differently, live life differently. Maybe we'll work at home more. Maybe we will include remote family and friends in life moments via Zoom more. Maybe shul won't be 3 hours long on Shabbat morning anymore. And maybe we'll daven on the terrace, even when we don't have to. Maybe we'll travel to Israel more because we don't take it for granted anymore that we can go there when we want to, be with our loved ones there when we want to. Maybe we'll wear a mask on the flight by choice, or maybe not. And for those whose focus in this pandemic time has been a new future, I want to advocate for the importance of not forgetting that we also need to return to the way things were, the Breshit model of redemption, when it becomes possible. We should hug again with permission when we can. We should restore the warm, physically connective community that defines us. We should come back to shul in person when we can, even when it doesn't look exactly the way it did before, because going to shul in person is something we did before and was the lifeblood of our communal life. There's great power to individual prayer and great power to prayer and connection in community, in diverse community, where we don't agree on almost anything, but we daven together. And that strengthens our sense of community, holds our agreements and our disagreements in a place of love. A final note from this first vision of the end point of redemption, both being a forward look to the future and a look back to a restoration of the way things were. This message, when delivered at rock bottom, wasn't actually a message that could be heard in its time. Right after Moshe hears those 4 languages of redemption and he goes and delivers the message to the Jewish people, do you know what the Torah says? V'lo shamu el Moshe mikotzer ruach u'me'avodah kasha. They could not hear or internalize a word he said because they couldn't breathe, as we feel so often these days in our masks, literal or figurative, because they were overloaded with work and burden, as we still so often feel in these days. And do you think the butler heard Yosef's message? Maybe he hopefully heard the part about being restored to the way his life once was, but he didn't hear Yosef's request to actually remember him. Lo zachar Sarah moshkim et Yosef vayishkachehu. He couldn't actually hear the entirety of the message of redemption that was delivered to him in that moment. So as I offer this hope about moving forward and also restoration, I know we're not even all always in the place to hear it. And I hold the place wherever we each are, weighed down, still struggling, and also invite us all in our own ways to open our ears, open our hearts, open our hopes, to know that we're so much further along than we were last year, that we're closer and closer to the place we want to be, the future place and the place of restoration. If this verse from Breshit is surprising as a source for the 4 cups on the Seder night, because it invites us to consider that redemption also means looking back, restoration, and not just revolution, it's an even more surprising source when we ask the second question about our Seder journey, our journey to freedom. Whose journey is it? Whose liberation, whose freedom are we focused on tonight? This is the second question, the second message of the 4 cups. The Exodus source gives us the obvious answer and the natural answer and the right answer, the liberation and the freedom of the Jewish people. That's where the focus of Pesach night should lie. The mitzvah of the night, the central mitzvah, is to tell our national story of liberation, a story we must retell over and over, what it means to go from being slaves to being free, what that freedom means for all of us. It's a time to reflect around our Seder tables on our national identity. What does it mean to be a member of Am Yisrael? What does it mean to be a Yehudi ben Chorin, a free Jewish person? It's a time to reflect on our national covenantal relationship with God. What does God ask of us? What do we do in our relationship with God? So central to this message of the 4 languages of redemption. We didn't walk out of Egypt on our own. We went bound up in a covenantal relationship with God. What does that relationship look like in 2020, 2021? What's our relationship with God? It's a time to think about our relationship with all Jews. The Seder table we're blessed to have so often, so many years, as a microcosm of the Jewish people. Between our family, our friends, our guests, we look around. They're not all Jewish people who look or do or act like us. They're the 4 children. They're the diversity, the blessed diversity of the Jewish people. Pesach is a night for embracing and reflecting on our innermost communities, our Jewish families, our Jewish shul, and the diversity and breadth of our Jewish peoplehood. how true this was and continues to be in the pandemic. We got through this and we continue to try to get through this as a Bayit community. We have stuck to our core messages, even reshaping and reapplying them. Our message of inclusivity, continuing to pair Zoom tefillah with in-person tefillah when so few shuls continue to do this. And so many people from other shuls not attending in-person tefillah have joined our tefillot over Zoom. We continue to check in with each other, check in on those who might be a little bit more isolated or need a little more support. We continue to try to care for the whole person with breath, body, mind, with process space, with ways to connect socially, even when it's hard to connect in person in larger groups in the ways we once did and will yet again. We're getting through this as a Bayit Jewish community. We're getting through this as a collective Jewish community. When I think back to a year ago and the decision to close shul, I was adamant that if we're going to do it, and we need to do it, we should do it as a community. It took so many conversations over a 24-hour period, but we reached the moment when all the shuls in Riverdale closed their in-person doors at the same time. And our Riverdale Jewish Community Partnership, the RJCP, that does so many things that we are aware of and that we aren't aware of, its true time of flourishing has been through this pandemic. We have built and flexed our collective Jewish communal muscles to do all kinds of things. First and foremost, take care of each other, but also act, activate, and advocate in so many ways. And as a global Jewish community, we've turned to people around the world to say Kaddish for our loved ones when we weren't meeting, and we did it in kind for them. One quick story from Glenn Richter, the tzaddik of the Soviet Jewry movement and an extended member, virtual member of our Bayit. Back in November, the Bayit promoted a British United Synagogue project asking Jews outside of the United Kingdom to say Kaddish for those who are mourning in the United Kingdom when it was under lockdown. Glenn saw this opportunity through our Bayit and signed up. And a couple of months after the project went live, he was reached out to by a man named Roland who lived in London, asking him to say Kaddish for his father, Stanley, who had just died. Glenn wrote me, several days ago, this was in January, I'm reciting Kaddish during Shacharit, and another guy saying Kaddish looks back at me. After shul, I tell him who I'm reciting Kaddish for. This guy, Yoram, is astonished. He's a Londoner, lived 2 blocks away from Stanley, and knew him and his son Roland. He'd heard about Stanley's passing, and just a couple of days earlier paid a phone Shiva call to his widow. Now he could call her back and tell her he heard Kaddish being said across the world for her dear husband. This is what the 4 cups remind us of. Our freedom as a Jewish people depends on doing it together as a people, together with Medinat Yisrael, our homeland and ultimate destination, to whom we turn our tefillah, our support, and our willing hands to make her the best she can be, each in our own way, with our voices. But then along comes the source from Breshit and invites us to consider something radically different. What is the message of the source from Breshit, of the butler's dream? It's that if the Seder night is a journey of freedom, the paradigm is the freedom of a non-Jewish government service worker, a food service employee. Let's call him a frontline worker who wants to get out of prison and return to his life as a productive member of society. And the 4 cups on our Seder night are based on his story, his despair, and the promise that he receives of personal redemption that ultimately comes to pass. Why should this be the message of the Seder journey embodied by the 4 cups of wine? What does it even have to do with us? Here's where one difference between the version in the Midrash and the version in the Yerushalmi becomes very relevant. I'm going to try to touch on this briefly as I see how much more I want to say and what time it is. The Midrash in Breshit Rabbah has a more expanded version of the story of the meaning of the dream. As you see, the first part of the dream, which talks about the butler envisioning grapes, is actually interpreted by the Midrash, and it seems by Yosef in his own mind, to tell the story of the redemption of the Jewish people. The grapevine was an allusion to the nation of Israel, the 3 clusters, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam, and the hastening, blossoming, sprouting, and ripening is a message that it's going to move quickly, the journey of the redemption of the Jewish people. And in fact, later on, in the very end of the Midrash in Breshit Rabbah, after Yosef interprets it for the butler, the beginning of his interpretation, says the Midrash, is explained as follows. The Midrash places Yosef's interpretation of the cupbearer's dream in the context of the meaning assigned to the dream by the Midrash above, as a portent of Israel's ultimate redemption from Egyptian bondage. And so Yosef says to the butler, At bisartani b'sorah tova, af ani avasrecha b'sorah tova. You gave me good tidings. You told me that the Jewish people whose sojourning in Egypt actually has begun with my being sold down there as a slave, says Yosef. You told me we will ultimately be freed. So I'm going to tell you that you will ultimately be freed. So for the Midrash in Breshit Rabbah, really the reason that the butler's dream is the source for the four cups is because the butler is the herald of the redemption of the Jewish people. He is a player in the bigger Jewish story. But that's not the Yerushalmi's approach. The Yerushalmi mentions nothing of Yosef's role, of the bigger story, of the redemption of the Jewish people. For the Yerushalmi, unapologetically, the source of the four cups on the Seder night are the four cups of the butler serving Paro. I believe this invites us to consider a much wider vision of redemption on the Seder night. That alongside our national story, the Seder night is asking not what the role of non-Jews is in our liberation, but the opposite. What role do we as individuals, as Yosefs, play in the interconnected relationships we have with any and every other human being we encounter in our lives? How do we help lift them up from imprisonment to service? That's why I have always appreciated, after and secondary to the focus of the Seder being on our national liberation, past and present, turning to reflect on what individuals and groups are currently in need of liberation and freedom, and what role we can play in that. To me, taking this rabbinic tradition of the butler's dream as offered in the Yerushalmi as a source for the four cups means putting the liberation of every human being on our Seder table. It's something my late Aunt Sarah, who died of Alzheimer's and COVID this past year, would do at our Seder. Lift up the needs of those enslaved or suffering around the world, different groups in different years. This year, I think about the Uyghur community, as she would have, raising our consciousness to our human interconnectedness. If there's one thing we can say about this year, it's that it has radically transformed our understanding and appreciation of those who work in the service sector. We can no longer see ourselves as separate from them. They became our heroes this year, but they always were. They did what they do every year: deliver groceries, prepare food in restaurants, collect garbage, clean homes, take care of our children. But this year we understood that we could not survive without them. We understood how intimately our fates were bound up. Our safety and welfare depended on theirs, and that really we are all one big us. We are not free or safe if they are not free or safe, and vice versa. But as Maya Bernstein said to me, words I have carried with me every day in this pandemic, we have all been in the same storm, but we have not all been in the same boat. So if the path forward from here involves greater investment in the welfare and rights of service workers, of domestic workers who are so unprotected in their workplaces, and if it involves looking at who in our mass incarceration system is prevented from having productive lives and how our mass incarceration system prevents so many from having productive lives, then we will have understood and learned from this second source for the four cups of the Seder night. And while God lurks in the background, the source of dream interpretation, according to Yosef, this story is about human initiative and action. When God is concealed, everything depends on us. That's why I've been so moved by the way this model has played out by our proliferation of volunteers in our Bayit in this pandemic time. Friendly callers, meal deliverers, the coordinators of this effort. And most recently, the volunteers in our vaccine WhatsApp group. I believe probably 200 or more people have gotten vaccine appointments, rides to vaccines, because of the work of these volunteers. And it has followed the trajectory of these two sources. We did begin with our innermost community, Holocaust survivors in our midst, those most needy or vulnerable in our Bayit community, and then expanded, thinking about how our volunteers could deploy their experiences learned to faith communities that are our neighbors, to our restaurant workers in our community who are a part of our inner community, to those who work in our buildings, and on and on and on. Our Seder isn't complete, can't even begin, until everyone has what they need at every level. That's the message of the Halach Ma'anya. And it too is the message of the beautiful comment of the Kitzur Bal HaTurim here in source 11, going back to our first source for the languages of redemption for the four cups, V'hotzeti, V'hitzalti, V'ga'alti, V'lakachti. Comments the Kitzur Bal HaTurim, B'gematria zeh, this has the equivalent numerical value to Ani b'Yisrael lo yifchetu lo me'arba kosot, to the very first instruction of the 10th chapter of Tractate Psachim about the Seder night, which is make sure everybody has what they need to participate. That's perhaps the inner Jewish version of the message. And if I could construct a gematria on the fly, I would say that the gematria of Kos Paro is make sure every member of our human race has the opportunity to find their path to redemption, because without theirs, we don't have ours. A final note about these two proof texts as we close our second message of the Seder night of the four cups, about whose liberation and whose journey this is all about. There's a profound link between these two source stories that I want to share with you. And it's about remembering to keep our ears open and our minds fresh to the needs of those around us. The story from Shemot begins, God's expression of those four languages of redemption begins with God's comment to Moshe, Va'ezkor et beriti, I remember my covenant. Lachein, therefore, tell the Jewish people, I am the Lord, and the very first thing I'm going to do is V'hotzeti, take you out. From Zichira to Hotza'ah. From remembering, attending, choosing what we notice and pay attention to being moved to bring others out from slavery to freedom. Right at the end of Yosef's interpretation of the dream to the butler, he says, Ki im zichartani itecha, if you would just remember me, Vasita naim adi chesed, do loving kindness for me, V'hizkartani el paro, make sure Paro remembers me. Then what? V'hotzetani min habayit hazeh. Then I know you will be able to take me out of this house, also a Beit Avadim, a house of bondage, a house of imprisonment. These are the only two stories in the Tanakh that I have been able to find which link Zichira to Hotza'ah, remembering to bringing forth. We have to remember to take others out. What will our lives look like after this pandemic? Just like the butler forgot, will we forget those with whom our fates are bound up? Or will we emulate God? Hear the cries, remember, stay in relationship, and do our part to free each other. This is the second message of the four cups at the Seder, to help us recognize the centrality of our national redemption and reflect on it, and not to forget about the redemption of every person. And in this pandemic year, to really internalize our interconnectedness and work to lift us all up. Thus far, we've been thinking about the four cups as mile markers, as indicators that we're on the journey of the Seder night, a journey from slavery to freedom. And we focused on where the end point of that journey is and on whose journey it is. I now want to turn for a few minutes to a halachic question about the reason for the four cups, not the Torah link for the four cups, the story of meaning for the four cups, but the reason why we actually have 4 cups at the Seder. That will bring us into a deeper reflection about our relationship to mitzvot, how they've been challenged and changed in this pandemic, and how we might reassess them yet again as we move forward. At first glance, the Midrash and the Yerushalmi seem to see the 4 cups as a mitzvah unto themselves, like as though the rabbis looked out at the Seder night and said, we have matzah, we have maror, we have karpas, what else do we need? Let's have 4 cups of wine, just like appear in Shmot and Breshit and all those other places. This approach is reflected in the next source. Source 12, in the tractate Psachim, in which Ravina says, Arba'a kasei takinu rabanan derech cherut, kol chad v'chad mitzvah ba'anpei nafshahu. Our rabbis established 4 cups on the Seder night as a way of expressing freedom. We have maror for bitterness, we have karpas for redemption and springtime, we have matzah, which was the bread of our affliction and the remembrance of our going forth. We need a beverage, a drinking experience that will allow us to express our freedom, a symbol of freedom, of royalty. And let's establish a series of cups of wine to create that expression. In this sense, the cups of wine are a religious, emotional ritual. They express a feeling. We have no limitations upon our imbibing, not like slaves who have so many rigid restrictions placed on them. We can eat and drink freely and drink wine, which allows us to loosen ourselves up because we can be whoever and whatever we want to be because we're free. The cups are the symbol of our cherut, our freedom. In fact, the Rambam expresses this so powerfully in the way he frames the entire Seder night, the mitzvah to see ourselves as though we went forth. In every generation, one must show oneself as if we had personally come out of Egypt. Lefichach, a very, very strong causal link. Therefore, when we sit down to eat on the Seder night, we eat and drink all of the symbols and rituals of the night, and our reclining is in the direction of freedom. And the first instance that the Rambam brings to demonstrate this is Kol echad ve'echad, bein anashim, bein nashim, every person, chayav lishtot balayla hazeh arba'a kosot shel yain. Everyone has to have 4 cups of wine. The cups of wine are the symbol of our freedom. They are a mitzvah which was enacted to evoke and express a feeling of this night as being a night of freedom. But that's only one of 2 central approaches. Tosfot in Sukkah 38a, and as the Gemara will later seem to support in many ways, offers a totally different approach. The one that may be more intuitive if we stop and think about where those cups of wine are actually placed when we read through the Mishnah and Psachim and when we make our journey through the Seder night. And for those who watched my little teaser video, the points at which I lifted up the 4 cups of wine. As Tosfot says in Sukkah 38a, Umistama lo tiknu arba kosot ela kedei lomar aleihem halel va'agada. The reason the rabbis instituted the 4 cups were to say things on those cups to enhance the recitation of Hallel and Magid. And of course, we can fill in the other 2 cups to enhance the Kiddush and Birkat HaMazon. In other words, the Seder night has its mitzvot of speech. Kiddush, Magid, telling the story, Hallel, praise, and Birkat HaMazon, the regular grace after meals, after our hearty Seder meal. Each mitzvah, says Tosfot, focusing on the less obvious 2, gets a cup of wine. The function of the cup of wine is to draw our attention to those ritual mitzvot. Maybe the way they feel unique on the Seder night, but the cups are not an expression of freedom so much as they are in service of the ritual speech mitzvot of the Seder night. So the first approach sees the cups as their own unique aspect of the Seder night, a standalone, maybe even 4 standalone experiences that collectively create a sense of freedom and emotion, a sense of being on the Seder night. The second approach sees the cups as not unique and independent, but rather as strengtheners, enhancers of the existing system of speech mitzvot, of mechanical, practical, physical, embodied, action-oriented mitzvot of the night. The other main mitzvot of the night are mitzvot of eating themselves. They don't need cups of wine. But the mitzvot of speech that we do on this night get cups of wine to draw our attention to these practical, mechanical mitzvot. In fact, some interesting consequences can emerge from this debate. What if you sat down at the Seder night and drank 4 cups of wine, reclining at random points during the Seder, not at the prescribed moments? You didn't particularly drink your cup of wine at Hallel or over Magid, but you drank 4 cups of wine. Did you fulfill the obligation of the 4 cups of wine? According to the first approach, maybe you did. You experienced freedom by having 4 cups of wine, but certainly not according to the second. You didn't lift up the standard mechanical mitzvot of the night. Can someone fulfill their obligation of the 4 cups by the Seder leader drinking them on our behalf? According to the first approach, for sure not. You can't vicariously experience freedom. But according to the second approach, maybe yes. Even if you didn't use a cup for Kiddush or Hallel, those mitzvot were elevated by the person who did. What underlies this machloket, this debate about the function of the 4 cups? What I want to suggest tonight, a bit more broadly and a bit more homiletically, is that the debate invites us to tease apart 2 aspects of our life of Torah and mitzvot, an apt thing to reflect upon on the Seder night, the night we go from being the servants of Paro to the servants of God, the night we embrace that system of Torah and mitzvot, which is our guide for every moment of our lives. While it's hard to separate the following 2 things, I think this machloket about the reason and the basis of the 4 cups points us towards 2 aspects of our mitzvah lives: the basic mechanical fulfillment of our obligations and the emotional meaning-making aspect of them. The mechanical, physical mitzvot and the emotional, affective mitzvot. The first approach, in the first sources that we saw, said that these 4 cups are here to express freedom, that the mitzvot are about the emotional. It's the parts of our religious lives that live in the space of feeling, of connectedness, of godliness. The 4 cups symbolize mitzvot and practices of feeling and emotion. The second approach, embodied by that comment of Tosfot, that these cups are here to strengthen the mitzvot of speech, Kiddush, Magid, Hallel, Birkat HaMazon, points us to the sense of the 4 cups as symbolic of performative, physical mitzvot, things we're supposed to say or do, actions, rituals that are incumbent upon us. As you can probably feel, dividing between these 2 categories is slippery and difficult. Even the first approach, the feeling of freedom, still requires an action, the drinking of wine. Even the second approach, the emphasis on performative mitzvot, still has some feeling of sanctity, of appreciation when we do them. And of course, we need them both, as the Gemara ultimately concludes. Rav Chanan said to Rava in source 15, this is right after talking about the Mishnah that says that Birkat HaMazon is recited over a kos. Amar lei, arba kasei tiknu rabanan derech cherut, kol chad v'chad naved bei mitzvah. It's both. Yes, the cups are there to express freedom, but let's also attach them to the existing mitzvot. The cups symbolize both the emotional, affective experience of freedom and the linkage and the power of the basic rituals that it's incumbent upon us to do almost whether we feel them, feel the meaning and the power that come along with them or not. Nowhere and in no time in our lives do I think these 2 aspects of mitzvah and Jewish practice were more disentangled, if they ever can be, than over the last year as the result of the pandemic. For many of us, our prayer lives, whether daily on Shabbat or on Shabbat, changed in this year at least twice. We went from praying at shul the old way to praying at home during lockdown, to, for many of us, praying back at shul the new way, the current way, without much song, without much physical closeness, without some of the normal frameworks of inclusion and participation that provided some of the affective, emotional parts of the prayer experience for so many of us over our relationship to tefillah at the bayit. We said the same words more or less at each of these stages, but the experience of those words, the emotional and religious valence and aura of them was transformed. And think about the holidays over this last year. We approached them with so much trepidation. How will it feel to have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur without Reb Eli, or without our families around the holiday table? How will it feel to have Sukkot without gathering all together to walk with our 4 species, even though we still took them We still perform the mechanical mitzvah. What will Purim feel like without the joy of the day that's generated by crowds and togetherness and the handing of many mishloach manot one to another? And our life cycles. How do we mourn a loved one or welcome a new life or celebrate a bar mitzvah without some of the feelings evoked by doing it in in-person community, by being able to share food together, one of the environmental aspects of those mitzvot that allow us to connect and perform them together? And we found answers to those questions for ourselves. And we tried to find answers to those questions as a community. If you haven't been back to in-person tefillah, come. Be open to experiencing something different than it was, and different than it will be, but something that stands on its own 2 feet, a new emotional, affective experience. Please don't think that I'm saying here that we had no emotional experience, no spirituality or connectedness or feelings in tefillah or chagim or our mitzvah lives in this last year. But we didn't know exactly what it would be until we got there. Maybe it came more from within. Maybe it came from the feeling of gratitude of just being able to do whatever it is that we could do and appreciating the blessing of having whatever we had, not dwelling in what it wasn't. Maybe it came from tying some of those experiences to outdoors, or the new feeling of doing some of them over Zoom and the ways in which that transformed. I think about our Yizkor before Chagim, in which we held up the pictures of our loved ones alongside our own faces and saw them with each other. That was different. That brought something new, a new affective experience. We decoupled and then recoupled action and meaning, doing and feeling in our mitzvah lives this year. For some of us, that has been harder. For some, it has been easier. For some parts have been harder and some parts have been easier. We're finding our way through this part of the journey together. This, for me, then, is the third mitzvah, the third message of the 4 cups that comes from understanding the debate about their function, about why they were enacted to exist on the Seder night. Through the debate over seeing them as primarily an affective, emotional mitzvah, as about the spontaneous expression of freedom, as opposed to, or alternatively, as playing a supporting role that draws our attention to mitzvot of action, of speech, of doing, of ritual, and ultimately seeing that the Gemara accepts both. We understand that our religious lives are an interplay of actions and feelings. Not only do we need them both, but sometimes we can actually reinvent some of the feelings or get at them in new ways. And indeed, sometimes we can actually innovate the actions themselves or do them in new ways when some of the infrastructure that provided them in the old ways falls away. There has been a kind of nimbleness, an openness to exploration and experimentation in our bayit this year that I want to hold on to. It takes flexibility and openness as a community, even if it's as simple as changing the davening times and locations almost every month is in accordance with our capacity limits and the time of tefillah and the needs of different members of our community. May we hold on to that as we begin to have the opportunity to return to how things were, and give us pause to consider that they don't have to be in all ways the way they were. We've seen these 4 cups now as a way of marking the journey of the Seder and the journey of this year. The balance between moving forward and recapturing what was lost, the need for grounding in our collective Jewish experience of liberation and connection, and then moving outward to appreciate how bound up our well-being is in the lives of service workers and so many around us, and the need to truly attend to them, lizkor kedei lahotzi, to remember in order to make us all freer. And finally, reflected on the evolving dynamic relationship between mitzvot of action and mitzvot of feeling, and the components of action and emotion in our religious lives. There's another reason the source from Bereshit was chosen to be a paradigm of the 4 cups, though, and it will set us off in our final exploration. Why did the rabbis choose the story of the butler's dream as the source for the place of 4 appearances of the word kos? Well, I'll let you in on a secret. It's because it's the only time in Chamisha Chumshei Torah that the word kos appears. There are no other cups in the whole Chumash other than these. This cluster of 3 appearances of kos in the butler's dream, once in its interpretation, and once a bit later in its coming true, is the only story in which the word kos comes up in the Torah. So this source text invites us to consider what a kos is, what a cup represents. In fact, it feels like the kos in the Arba Kosot is as important to pay attention to as what's inside it. We don't call this mitzvah colloquially the 4 shtiyot, the 4 drinkings, the 4 yenot, the 4 wines, but rather the Arba Kosot, the 4 cups. Our attention is drawn to the vessel. What is a kos? What is its message for us in the journey of the Seder night? A kos is an object in the deepest sense. It's acted upon. Go back to the story. Kos paro biyadi. The cup is in my hand. I squeeze the grapes into the kos. I place the kos into Paro's hand. A kos is a transactional, relational object. It's passed from person to person. In the moments of joyous experience, when we share a cup together, something we may have missed doing in this time, it creates connection. It's an object which holds relationship, a placeholder for creating connection. Let's return to the Midrash in the Yerushalmi, which adds another dimension to the idea of kos in the sources for the 4 cups. After mentioning the 4 kingdoms, the rabbis then said, and if I were going to add a layer of weight, of heft to this interpretation, it's the fact that it's the one attributed to all the sages. Yes, the first 2 were the most familiar of the languages of redemption, and the second so powerful, the individual story, the story of the butler's dream. But this is Rabbanan Amrei. This is the rabbis, our collective sages, telling us what they see in the 4 cups. כנגד 4 כוסות של פורענות שהקדוש ברוך הוא עתיד להשקות את אומות העולם. And we evoke this in some small way when we say shvoch hamatcha al hagoyim, pour out your wrath upon the nations. That cup in some way evokes these cups, the cups of punishment that God will pour out upon the nations of the world in the future as a part of our redemption in particular moments when we have been oppressed, enslaved by them, or they have taken the world in a direction of not knowing God. 4 instances of kos in prophecies of redemption of the Jewish people, but in prophecies that talk about destruction or visitation of punishment on the other nations. By the way, we must note about that final cup, Menat Kosam, says the Yerushalmi. Mahu Menat Kosam, Rabbi Avin says, deeply poterin. This is Paterian wine. So I don't know if this made it into the Hogwarts Haggadah, but for anyone who wants to share a little Harry Potter Torah at your Seder, here it is, Paterian wine. And then, ukeneged, continue the rabbis, Atid HaKadosh Baruch Hu lahashkot et Yisrael, arba'a kosot shel nechamot. God in kind will give the Jewish people 4 cups of consolation, 4 cups of redemption to drink. On first glance, we'll come back to them in a moment. First glance, it seems to me this should be 8 cups then. We have the 4 cups of the punishment of our enemies and the 4 cups of our redemption and consolation. But the fact that they are the same reminds us that the same cup can be totally different for different people. It can be in one moment a sense of despair and punishment, and in another, a sense of possibility and redemption, comfort and deliverance. It takes only a recourse to that most basic vision of how cups are all about attitude. Is the cup half full or half empty? To understand that what cups remind us is that while we may not be able to control how much is in there, we can control our attitude to what we have and what we don't have. Maybe the Midrash in this last take, Rabbana and Amrei, offer us a little bit of a journey, maybe even parallel to the 4 cups on the Seder night, about what this hopeful, optimistic perspective can look like. The first, Hashem menat chelki v'chosi. God is my portion, my cup. It's lifting up. In some way, we're saying here, I am a cup, and God is in me. Whatever I have in my life is a gift, and I'm grateful for that gift. Maybe this is the first cup, the cup of Kiddush. It's starting out the Seder night, starting out in this moment and saying, what I have is a gift, whatever it is. And there's so much that I've lost, but what my portion is, my cup is a gift. And then as we tell the story on the Seder night, the Magid, the second cup, it's Tishanta Vashem en Roshi, Kosi Revaya. It's to be able to say, can my cup, even if it has only a few drops, is it overflowing? Is it overflowing with whatever it is, the silver linings I've been able to find that have spilled out beyond me to reach out and connect with others? The third and fourth cups, which come close together at the end of the Seder night, Barech and Hallel, thanksgiving to God for what we have, praising God and thanksgiving, looking ahead to the future. Those are Kos Yeshuot. The rabbis here do a little quick math and get us from 2 cups to 4 cups by pointing out Kos Yeshuot Esa Terein. Because it's in plural, the cup of salvations, it's 2. Maybe these are the closely linked 3rd and 4th cups, the cups of thanksgiving and the cups of praise. Kos Yeshuot Esa. When we take our cup, our portion, our lot, our relationship to the gifted life that we have, as hard and challenging as it may be, see the ways in which it overflows, reaches out to connect to others, and then we lift it up. We elevate it. We make something of it. Kos Yeshuot Esa, Uv'Shem Adonai Ekra. And in the first person, we find for ourselves the way to call out to God. Maybe it's a cry of pain. Maybe it's a cry of hope. Maybe it's a cry of possibility. We don't always control how full our cup is, but we control how full it feels to us. One of the greatest inspirations to me in this last year has been our every other week phone calls with the group we call our Golden Agers. They are almost entirely women, mostly in their 80s, 90s, and a few who were a part of our group came close to or crossed over the threshold of the age of 100. It's a Zoom, but only about 3 of them are on video, most with the incredible help of Yael Manor-Oshinsky, who cares so devotedly, have learned to call in to Zoom. We get on the phone, and throughout the year, long before vaccines were even on the horizon, we would go around and do a check-in. Many live on their own. And I would ask, how's everybody today? And they would say, I haven't seen anyone or spoken to anyone in this number of days, or I haven't been outside in a little while, but you know what? I'm still here. I hope and pray, Rabbi, that this pandemic will be done soon. Then we can get back to the program as it used to exist when we would get together for lunch once a month in the lobby of the Bayit, see each other's faces. And how are you? And how's the shul? And how's your family? Kos Yeshuot Esa. They gave me hope, and they continue to. Every other week when we get on the phone. And those who may have the most challenges of any of us in our Bayit community, although we all have our challenges, were able to see the blessings that they had and remain hopeful, grateful for what they have. So perhaps it sheds a light onto a slightly different interpretation of a familiar Gemara. The Gemara which says Bishlosha dvarim adam nikar. A person's true character is ascertained in three ways. B'choso, u'v'chiso, v'chaso. Leaving aside the second and third, the pocket and our anger, and the possible fourth, that we are known through our laughter. Adam nikar b'choso. A person is understood through their cup. Many of the classic commentaries suggest that this has to do with the fact that when you have a little to drink, your true nature comes out. We're recognized through our cup. What I want to offer and suggest tonight is that koso, the way we relate to the volume inside our cups, what we make of whatever drops, however few or many we have, the way in which we see it as our portion, take ownership of it, let it flow out to connect with others, and then lift it up and call out to that which is beyond us. That's how we are nikar. That's how we are known. And our bayit in this time should be, has been, and is known for doing that, making the most of a challenging time, supporting each other, building, creating, extending community. And it's through the work of each and every one of you, logging into a Zoom, calling a neighbor, celebrating life cycle events under the most challenging of circumstances, asking how can I help, lifting up a voice, staying in touch. In a week's time, we arrive at the Seder table. There's so much to look forward to. Matzah, karpas, maror, stories, songs. And there is pain and loss. The empty seats of loved ones who passed, who haven't been mourned or said goodbye to in the way they deserved. The loved ones we haven't hugged or touched in a year. For some of us, I hope precious few, and if you are a person in this category, please reach out to us. Perhaps we can help it be different. For some of us, our Seder tables will be empty if we're on our own. For some, there are just fewer folks than usually are. As we prepare to begin a week from tonight, let's remember that the Seder is a journey. And what accompanies us on the journey is the Arba Kosot, our in-flight drink service, the 4 cups. They are not mere window dressing. They are our guides on the journey. They are reminders that we are in a dynamic, evolving Judaism and a dynamic, evolving moment as people, as households, as a bayit, as a city, country, and a world. They call upon us to picture that we've lost things that we want to yet recapture and to know we will. And in the same breath, they challenge us to recognize there is no pure return, only forward motion, taking the pieces of the past that we most want with us into the new future. They call upon us to know that we cannot and do not journey alone. We journey with the whole Jewish people. Only as a Jewish nation have we weathered this pandemic. Only with Medinat Yisrael have we and the world weathered this pandemic. And we also do not journey alone because we're bound up with all the members of our society. I'm sad that the 7 o'clock clap is no longer a thing. It should be. Our lives should never again be without that continual gratitude for the frontline workers and service workers and every person in our lives. We must know that our thriving is bound up with each other. We must not forget that. And the cups call upon us to recognize that the interplay between our emotional and practical religious lives is deep and profound, that it can be reinvented when needed. And the cups call upon us to remember that on the journey of the Exodus, on the pandemic journey, so much depends on how we view our cup. Our attitude, a sense of hope, not always easy to cultivate, but done with each other, can enable us to lift those cups and lift ourselves. This has, for so many of us, whether young or old, been the hardest year of our lives. Nothing can take away from that. And together with it, if we can lift that cup, cry out to God, and take control of that which we control, our perspective, who we help, where we see ourselves going, we can transform the cup in some way to the Kos Yeshuot, the cup of salvations, past, present, and future. Salvation from slavery in Egypt, salvation from this terrible plague, salvation from the challenges yet to come. I know I will look around this Seder night and count my blessings. My blessings to be lifting the cup with each and every one of you, of our Bait family and community. It's lighter, easier to lift because of you. May we find and feel God's salvation. Try to be the agents of that salvation together. Kos Yeshuotesa, O V'Shem Adonai Ekra. Kos Yeshuotesa, O V'Shem Adonai Ekra. May we lift a cup of salvation and together call out to God. May we lift a cup of salvation. May it be a year of health, togetherness, blessing, and peace. Chag Sameach, with love, love, and more love. Chag Sameach.